Before we dive into this epic tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more thrilling sci-fi adventures. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary day like any other. I woke up at the usual hour, made a cup of coffee, and sat down at my desk to start the day's work. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor, and I felt the calm peace of a morning routine. There was nothing special about that day. Or so I thought. In the days that followed, I often wondered if I could have seen it coming, or if my mind had been too wrapped up in the dull grind of life to notice. You know how things can seem so normal that you can't even imagine something out of the ordinary creeping in? The strangest part was that, in the beginning, it didn't even feel like something unusual was happening. It was just different. Something faint, like a shadow in the corner of your vision. But that feeling, the subtle, unexplainable sensation that gnawed at my thoughts, didn't let go. At first, it was nothing more than a few glitches in reality. A light flickering here, the sudden stillness of a room that had been buzzing with noise moments before. Little things, easily dismissed if you weren't paying attention. But the truth is, I wasn't paying attention. I had no reason to suspect that something bigger was at play. And then, there was the day the sky changed. It happened without warning, as though the world had shifted slightly, and we didn't know it until we noticed. One moment, I was sitting outside on my lunch break, watching the sky above, and the next, the color shifted. It wasn't a sunset or anything like that. The blue in the sky deepened, but not in a way that was natural. It almost seemed to pulse, like it was alive, as if the very fabric of the atmosphere had been altered in some unseen way. The air felt heavier, and the clouds seemed to move too quickly, as though they weren't floating at all, but rushing towards some unseen destination. My pulse quickened, and instinctively I reached for my phone, but there were no news reports, no breaking stories. It was as though the world hadn't noticed the strange phenomenon unfolding overhead. That night, I lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to reason it away, some strange atmospheric condition, maybe a meteorological oddity that no one had figured out yet, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something far more sinister was happening. Something that wasn't bound by the usual rules of nature. My gut told me this wasn't just an anomaly, it was a warning. But a warning of what, exactly? The twins showed up on the third night. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was too bizarre to be real. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an overwhelming presence in the room with me. It wasn't just a physical presence, it was something that weighed on my soul. Something that made every inch of my body scream in terror. I opened my eyes to find them standing there. Two figures standing just beyond the edge of the bed, their silhouettes bathed in the faint moonlight that filtered through the blinds. They were tall, impossibly tall, and their bodies seemed to shimmer with a strange light, as if their very forms were made of something fluid and changing. Their faces, if you could call them faces, were almost too perfect, too symmetrical. It was like looking at a reflection of a reflection, but it wasn't right. They didn't belong in the world. The fear hit me like a tidal wave, but I couldn't look away. Their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly with an unnatural light. I felt their gaze pierce into me, as though they could see into the deepest corners of my mind. They didn't speak at first. I could feel their words before they were even formed, drifting into my consciousness like tendrils of thought. We are here. We need your help. The voice was like a whisper in the back of my mind, but it didn't come from anywhere. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart raced, and I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, as if the air itself had turned thick and suffocating. One of them moved forward, the other staying behind, their presence still looming like a shadow over me. As it reached out, I could see its hand, long, slender fingers that seemed to extend further than a human's would ever be able to. But it wasn't its hand that terrified me, it was the sense of power emanating from them, an overwhelming force that made the very air feel electrified. Without warning, the room seemed to shift. The walls faded away, and in their place was a vast expanse, a void of stars. The twins, though still there, appeared as if they were both part of the vast, infinite space and apart from it. Their forms were both familiar and alien, their presence filling the entire universe. The sensation was maddening, as if the boundaries of reality were being torn open, and I was being pulled into something I couldn't begin to understand. "We are not from here," the voice echoed in my mind. "We are the last of our kind, sent to find what we have lost. Your world is in danger, and you are the key." The words were sharp, like knives cutting through the veil of my disbelief. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me, yet some deep, primal part of me wanted to listen, wanted to understand what they were saying. I had no choice but to listen. The silence was unbearable. They showed me flashes, quick, chaotic glimpses, of their past, of the destruction that had ravaged their world. A race of beings like no other, their civilization had thrived until a terrible enemy had come for them. The invaders didn't just conquer, they consumed. It was a slaughter of unimaginable proportions. And the twins, they were the only survivors, the last remnants of a lost race. But their mission wasn't just about survival. It was about saving humanity from the same fate. They had come to Earth not by chance, but because they had learned something about us that we didn't even know ourselves. They didn't ask for my help. They didn't need me. But they made it clear that Earth was on the brink of annihilation. The invaders were coming, and they were unstoppable. Unless I chose to stand with them, humanity had no chance. And so, despite the fear that had taken root deep within me, despite the terror that came with the knowledge of the end of everything I had ever known, I understood. The fate of humanity wasn't just in the hands of the government or the military. It rested on the choices of ordinary people, people like me. What happened next, I couldn't fully grasp, but it set the stage for everything that was to come. The days following the encounter felt like a fever dream, but I knew one thing for certain: everything had changed. My mind kept replaying the words the twins had spoken, over and over again. Their presence, their power, and the weight of the knowledge they imparted to me hung like a shroud over my every waking moment. I felt it in my bones, the undeniable truth that something catastrophic was coming for us. The twins had made it clear: the enemy they faced wasn't just another alien race. They were a force that consumed entire civilizations, and they had their sights set on Earth. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen, subtle at first, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. People were changing. There was a quiet unease in the air, a feeling of impending doom that hung over every conversation, every glance. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't just the stress of the modern world. There was something darker at play. I wasn't the only one who could feel it. It seemed that as the days passed, the collective tension in the world grew thicker, suffocating, like the atmosphere had changed just slightly, enough to make everyone uncomfortable. The twins' message was clear, though. The invaders weren't like anything humanity had ever encountered before. They didn't need weapons, armies, or fleets. They had the ability to infiltrate, to manipulate and control without ever revealing their true presence. They were parasites, feeding on the very essence of life itself. Entire planets had fallen without a single shot being fired, without a single act of violence. The invaders simply erased everything: life, culture, history, and then moved on, leaving nothing behind but empty husks. The twins had explained their race's tragic fate. Their people, once peaceful and advanced beyond imagination, had been wiped out in a brutal campaign of assimilation. They had tried to fight back, but it was impossible. The invaders were everywhere, and they had the power to bend the very fabric of reality itself. The twins had survived only by fleeing, escaping to the farthest reaches of the galaxy in search of a world that could still resist the inevitable. They had come to Earth not by chance, but because they had found something in us, something in humanity that made them believe we could stand a chance. The more I learned about the twins, the more I understood that they weren't just survivors. They were the last hope for the galaxy. Their people had died fighting the invaders, but their survival was no accident. The twins were different, genetically altered, somehow enhanced. They had abilities that were beyond anything the human mind could comprehend, and they believed that if humanity could unite, if we could stand together, we could resist the coming onslaught. But that meant we had to act fast. I felt a responsibility, one I hadn't asked for, but couldn't deny. The fate of the planet rested on our shoulders, and it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for our future, for the future of everyone we loved. I could no longer go about my life as I had before. The weight of the twins' words and the looming threat of the invaders had transformed me. I couldn't pretend everything was okay. I couldn't ignore the danger. The first step, they told me, was to bring together a group of individuals, people who could help organize humanity's defense, who could spread the word of the coming invasion without causing mass panic. It was a delicate task. People were terrified, but they didn't understand what they were up against. No one could truly comprehend the scale of the threat. It wasn't something you could simply warn people about and expect them to understand. They would laugh, dismiss it as some kind of delusion. So, the twins gave me the tools to prepare, to organize, to strategize, and to begin assembling a resistance. But there was more. The twins had shared knowledge with me, knowledge that humanity wasn't ready for. They taught me things about the universe, secrets that no human had ever known, at least not in the way we would come to understand them. The invaders' true power lay not in their technology, but in their ability to manipulate energy itself. They could warp space and time, slip between dimensions, and even alter the fundamental laws of physics. This was why they had been unstoppable. But they had one weakness, something that humanity had, something the twins had never found in any other race they had encountered. The will to fight. The spirit that drove us, the resilience that defined us as humans. The invaders relied on the despair of their victims, on the broken will of those they consumed. They thrived on fear, on hopelessness. But humanity had something different. Even in the face of the darkest odds, we had a spark that refused to go out. That's what the twins had seen in us. They believed we had the power to resist, to survive, and even to win. But it wouldn't be easy. And so, I found myself at the center of a conflict I could hardly comprehend. I was just one person, and yet the fate of the world now rested on my actions. I had no military training, no special skills, but I had something else: the knowledge of the twins, the power of unity, and a burning desire to protect everything I held dear. I began reaching out to others, quietly at first, connecting with those who had the skills, the drive, and the willingness to fight. We were a motley group: scientists, military personnel, hackers, doctors, and civilians, people from all walks of life, all drawn together by the same terrifying reality. It was the beginning of something bigger than any of us had imagined. We started small, operating in the shadows, gathering intelligence, sharing what we knew. But as the days passed, we began to realize the scale of the enemy we were facing. The invaders were everywhere, and their influence had already begun to seep into our society. They had infiltrated governments, corporations, and institutions. They were in positions of power, controlling the flow of information, manipulating the narrative. We were up against an enemy that didn't just want to destroy us. They wanted to erase us, to strip away everything that made us who we were. The first few months felt like a blur. Everything moved so quickly, and I struggled to keep up. But every step forward brought us closer to the inevitable confrontation. The twins' knowledge was invaluable, but the more we learned, the more we realized how little time we had left. The enemy was already making their move. The invasion had begun, and humanity was no longer on the sidelines. We were in the fight of our lives. In the face of this overwhelming threat, there was no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. We had to act, and we had to act now. Our survival depended on it. We couldn't afford to wait any longer. The twins had given us the tools, the knowledge, and the hope we needed to stand against the darkness. But in the end, it was up to us to fight. We were the last line of defense, and failure was not an option. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of the situation began to set in. The twins had warned us about the invaders, but the true scope of their malevolence was far worse than we could have imagined. Our small resistance group had begun to grow, but so had the awareness of the imminent threat. News began to spread, though not in the way we had hoped. People were panicking, and the fabric of society was beginning to fray at the edges. Governments scrambled to find answers, and the military was overwhelmed by the increasing signs of strange phenomena that seemed to be spreading across the planet. We couldn't ignore it anymore. The invaders were masters of deception. They didn't attack directly, at least not at first. Their approach was far more insidious. They used technology we could barely comprehend to infiltrate communication networks, financial systems, and media outlets. The most disturbing thing wasn't the way they manipulated information. It was how they subtly twisted perceptions of reality. People began to doubt what they were seeing, hearing, or feeling. The idea that the invasion was nothing more than a series of unrelated events, natural disasters, economic collapses, and social unrest, began to take root. The invaders had set the stage for chaos, and they were ready to capitalize on humanity's weakness, our inability to work together in the face of uncertainty. We had to make a decision. The resistance could no longer remain a clandestine effort. We needed to expose the truth to the world, even if it meant putting ourselves in harm's way. The twins had given us the tools, but now it was time to put them to use. The knowledge they shared wasn't just about fighting back. It was about understanding the invaders' weaknesses, their motives, and their tactics. It was our only hope to turn the tide. I knew we had to act quickly. The resistance grew bolder, but so did the invaders' influence. The first signs of their direct involvement in global affairs were too subtle for most to notice, but we had been trained to see them. Key political figures began to act strangely. Military commanders who once held strong, decisive leadership were now making erratic, uncharacteristic decisions. The media was filled with messages of division and fear, subtly stoking tensions between nations and people. The invaders were playing a long game, carefully dismantling the unity that humanity relied on. They understood something that we hadn't yet realized. They didn't need to conquer us physically. They could tear us apart from the inside, and we'd destroy ourselves before they ever had to fire a shot. It was a horrifying realization. We were no longer fighting an external enemy alone. The battle for survival was a battle for our minds, our unity, and our will to fight. The invaders had infiltrated every level of society, from the highest government offices to the smallest neighborhoods. Their presence was everywhere, though it was still cloaked in secrecy. But the twins had taught us something invaluable. These invaders thrived on fear, confusion, and isolation. They sought to turn humanity against itself, to manipulate our darkest impulses and feed off the chaos. The more divided we were, the weaker we became. But what the invaders didn't understand was the one thing that made humans unique: our capacity for hope and resilience, even in the darkest of times. The twins believed in us, believed in our ability to unite and resist. And despite the overwhelming odds, we knew that they were right. The resistance began to take more daring actions, organizing covert operations to expose the truth and rally people to our cause. It wasn't enough to simply spread awareness. We had to prove that the threat was real, and we had to show people that there was hope. It was during this time that I began to understand the true nature of the invaders' power. It wasn't just their technological superiority or their ability to manipulate reality. It was their understanding of the human mind. They knew how to make us doubt ourselves, how to make us question our own instincts and beliefs. They were insidious, feeding on our darkest fears and using them to their advantage. But we had something they didn't understand: the ability to adapt, to learn, and to fight back when all seemed lost. I began to see how humanity could fight back. We had one advantage that the invaders couldn't replicate: our unpredictability. Unlike the invaders, we weren't bound by a single mind or a singular purpose. We were diverse, flawed, and disjointed in so many ways, but that very disunity was what made us powerful. We didn't think like them, and that gave us the upper hand. The more we learned, the more we realized that the invaders had underestimated us. They believed that if they could fracture our society, they could weaken us, but they failed to see the fire that burned inside every person. They failed to see our will to fight, to resist, and to protect what was ours. The resistance became more organized, and our efforts began to take shape. We developed new technologies based on the knowledge the twins had shared with us. We didn't have the advanced tech the invaders used, but we had something far more valuable: human ingenuity. We repurposed old machines, re-engineered alien technology, and created weapons that we could use to fight back. The first skirmishes against the invaders were nothing more than small-scale attacks, but they sent a message. We weren't going to go down without a fight. But even as we gained small victories, the invaders were always one step ahead. They had already begun their global manipulation, eroding the trust between nations, sowing distrust among allies, and inciting violence in the streets. They were masters of propaganda, and the media had become their greatest weapon. They had the power to twist the truth, to make us question our own reality, and to turn people against one another. But in every city, every corner of the world, the resistance was growing. People were waking up, realizing that the threat was real, and that they were not alone. The fight was far from over. But we were no longer fighting as individuals. We were no longer just a small group of rebels hidden in the shadows. We were a united force, standing against an enemy that had underestimated us at every turn. The twins had given us the knowledge we needed to fight back, but it was our unity, our willingness to stand together, that would make all the difference. It was time to show the invaders that humanity would not be cowed, that we would not succumb to fear, and that no matter how powerful they were, they could never break the human spirit. The battle for humanity's survival had entered a new phase. What we had once perceived as a simple fight against invaders had transformed into something far greater, a fight for our very identity. The resistance had grown into a force capable of challenging the aliens, but it was no longer just about repelling invaders. It was about reclaiming the future we had once taken for granted. We were fighting not just for our survival, but for the very soul of humanity. The twins had always said that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to adapt, to evolve when faced with overwhelming odds. I hadn't understood it at first, but as the weeks passed, I began to see the truth of their words. The invaders were powerful, far beyond anything we had ever encountered, but their arrogance was their greatest flaw. They believed that they could control us, manipulate us, and divide us into factions that would tear each other apart. What they failed to realize was that their greatest weapon, their manipulation of fear and division, was also our greatest weapon, unity. As the invaders tightened their grip on our world, their methods grew more sophisticated. They no longer hid behind technology or subtle tactics. They had begun to actively interfere with our global communications, sending out waves of disinformation, fostering paranoia, and exploiting our weaknesses. It was working. People were becoming more fearful, more distrustful, more isolated. But the more they tried to manipulate us, the more we began to realize how dangerous it was to be divided. We had to resist the temptation to turn against one another. We had to fight the fear that was being cultivated in every corner of the world. Our resistance grew stronger as we connected with others who shared the same resolve. What had begun as small, disjointed efforts now became a global movement. There were no longer barriers between nations or ideologies. We were all in this together, fighting the same enemy. It wasn't just about military might anymore. It was about spreading hope, about showing people that they had a choice in how they responded to the invaders. We couldn't afford to let fear take hold, and that meant empowering people to believe in themselves, and their ability to change the course of history. But the invaders had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. They had thought we were weak, fragile, easy to manipulate. They didn't understand the resilience we had, the fire that burned in our hearts when we were faced with injustice. The resistance became more organized, and it was no longer just about holding ground. We began to take the fight to them, striking at their weak points, using their own arrogance against them. They had believed they were untouchable, that their control over our minds and resources would give them dominion over the earth. But they hadn't anticipated the sheer willpower of a united humanity. We started to strike back, not with brute force, but with precision. We used their own tactics against them, infiltrating their networks, disrupting their communications, and undermining their plans. Every time they thought they had us cornered, we found a way out. Every time they believed they had broken our spirit, we found a way to rise again. We weren't just fighting to survive, we were fighting to prove a point. We had something they didn't, a deep, unshakable belief in our right to exist, to define our own destiny. The twins had told us that we were stronger than we realized, and each victory, no matter how small, proved them right. The invaders, for all their power, had no understanding of what it meant to be human. They couldn't comprehend the depth of our emotional strength, the power of our collective spirit. They saw us as mere ants in their grand plan, easily manipulated and controlled. But we proved them wrong. We didn't fight because we were desperate, we fought because we had something to protect. Our families, our friends, our communities, our culture. The invaders might have had the upper hand in technology, but they lacked the one thing that made humanity unique: the ability to rise above the worst of circumstances and fight for what mattered. As the resistance mounted its offensive, it was clear that the invaders were beginning to falter. They had underestimated us at every turn, and now they were paying the price. Their strategies, once so effective, were no longer working. Their communications broke down, their hold on the minds of the masses began to weaken, and their forces began to fragment. What had once been an overwhelming force now appeared disjointed, fractured. The more they tried to divide us, the more we came together. The more they tried to instill fear, the stronger our resolve became. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for the future. We weren't just resisting invaders, we were reclaiming our place in the universe. And with each victory, each step forward, we learned more about the invaders' true motives. They weren't just here to conquer us, they were here because they feared us. They feared our potential, our resilience, and our ability to rise above any challenge. They feared the very thing that made humanity unique: our capacity to survive and thrive in the face of adversity. It became clear that the final battle would not be won with weapons alone. It would be won with unity, with the power of human spirit and the strength of our collective will. The invaders might have had superior technology, but they didn't understand the one thing that could defeat them: the indomitable will of humanity. The twins had shown us the way, but it was up to us to finish the fight. The strength we had built over the course of the struggle was more than just physical or technological. It was the heart of what made us human. Now, as we faced the final stage of the battle, it wasn't about simply defeating the invaders. It was about showing them, once and for all, that humanity could never be broken. We had endured through the worst they could throw at us, and we had come out stronger for it. The war was far from over, but the first steps toward victory had been taken. And when the dust settled, when the invaders had been driven from our world, one thing would be clear: humanity had not just survived, it had triumphed. And that triumph, that unwavering spirit, would echo through the stars for as long as our species existed. The battle was over, but the true cost had yet to be fully realized. In the aftermath of the war, as we picked up the pieces of a shattered world, it became clear that what had started as a fight for survival had grown into something far more profound. The invaders had been pushed back, their influence shattered, but their mark on humanity would never be erased. It wasn't just the scars of war that remained, it was the fundamental shift in how we saw ourselves and our place in the universe. Humanity had been tested in ways we had never imagined. We had been pushed to the edge of extinction, forced to confront our darkest fears and our deepest insecurities. But we had not only survived, we had triumphed. The fight had revealed something essential about us: that even in the face of impossible odds, we would never give up. We would never stop fighting. That relentless, unyielding spirit was what had carried us through the darkest days of the invasion, and it was that spirit that would carry us forward into the future. Yet, the victory was not without its cost. The physical damage to our cities, our infrastructure, and our environment was immense. Entire regions had been decimated, whole populations lost. The war had torn families apart, and the wounds it had inflicted on our societies would take years, if not decades, to heal. The economic toll was staggering, and the psychological scars were deep. But amidst the devastation, there was something extraordinary: hope. The human spirit, once again, had proved to be far stronger than the forces that sought to crush it. In the years that followed, we rebuilt, not just our cities and our economies, but ourselves. The war had stripped us of the illusions we had once held about our place in the world. It had shattered the notion that we were fragile, easily controlled, and easily defeated. The invasion had shown us that we were capable of far more than we had ever imagined. We had the ability to adapt, to learn, and to fight back in ways that no one, not even the invaders, could have predicted. We had fought for our survival, but in doing so, we had also discovered our true strength. The twins, who had once seemed like mysterious and distant figures, became symbols of that strength. They had not only been our guides through the darkest hours of the invasion, they had been a living testament to the power of humanity to rise above adversity. They had shown us that we were capable of greatness, even when the odds were stacked against us. Their presence had been a reminder that even in the face of the unknown, there was always a way forward. And as we rebuilt, we carried their example with us, an example of resilience, of courage, and of hope. But the lessons learned in the heat of battle were not just about survival. They were about something deeper, the realization that our strength came not just from our ability to fight, but from our ability to unite. The war had divided us, yes, but it had also shown us the power of coming together, of transcending differences, and of working toward a common goal. We had been divided by ideologies, by politics, by race, and by class, but in the end, we had found a way to put those differences aside and fight as one. It was a lesson that would shape the future of humanity. As we looked to the stars, to the vast expanse of space that had once seemed so distant, we no longer saw it as a place of unknown threats and dangers. We saw it as a place of infinite possibilities. The war had shown us that we were not just inhabitants of Earth. We were a species capable of reaching beyond our home planet and making our mark on the universe. The victory over the invaders had given us something more than just survival. It had given us the confidence to explore, to discover, and to expand. The fear that had once held us back had been replaced by a new sense of purpose, a new sense of unity. But that unity came at a price. The scars of the war, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. The wounds left by the invaders' brutality ran deep, and there were moments when it seemed like the weight of the past would crush us. But we persevered, as we always had. We found strength in each other, in our shared humanity. The war had shown us what we were capable of, and it had also shown us what we had lost. But it also reminded us that we could rebuild, and that the future was ours to shape. In the years that followed, the legacy of the war became a guiding force. We did not forget the lessons we had learned in the heat of battle. We did not forget the sacrifices made by countless individuals, many of whom had given their lives for the survival of humanity. We honored their memory by ensuring that their struggle was not in vain. We rebuilt our world, but we also reshaped our values. We embraced diversity, not as a weakness, but as a strength. We learned to work together, to share resources, and to build a future that was not just for a select few, but for all of humanity. The invaders had come to our world with the belief that they could conquer us, that they could break us. They had underestimated our resilience, our capacity to fight back, and our ability to adapt. In the end, they had learned a harsh truth, that humanity could not be conquered. We were a species that could withstand the greatest of challenges, and we would emerge stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The war was over, but the story of humanity's resilience had just begun. We had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, scarred but unbroken. We had learned that the strength of humanity was not in its technology or its weapons, but in its heart, in its will to survive, and in its ability to come together when the world seemed at its darkest. The war had shown us what we were capable of, and in doing so, it had changed the course of our history forever. As we looked to the stars, we knew that the future was ours to shape. The universe was vast, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But we were no longer the fragile, vulnerable species we had once been. We were a force to be reckoned with, a species that had faced extinction and emerged victorious. The legacy of the war, the lessons we had learned, would guide us as we moved forward into the unknown. And whatever challenges the future held, we knew that as long as we remained united, we would always find a way to prevail. The human spirit was unstoppable, and it would carry us through whatever lay ahead.